Marcus Sullivan stared at the inheritance that had made him the laughingstock of Millbrook. 3 acres of rusted metal, broken appliances, and decades of accumulated junk that his eccentric great-uncle had somehow convinced the county to let him hoard. The property taxes alone would bankrupt him within months, and every salvage company he'd called had laughed at the idea of clearing it for free. His golden retriever, Ranger, sniffed through the maze of debris while Marcus calculated how much it would cost to haul everything to the dump. That's when Ranger started pawing frantically at a section of ground beneath an overturned washing machine, whining in a way Marcus had never heard before. As Marcus pulled away layers of rust and refuse, his shovel struck something solid, concrete steps leading down into darkness. What could his hermit uncle have been hiding beneath 20 years of carefully arranged trash? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Sullivan had never imagined himself as a property owner, let alone the reluctant heir to what the locals called Crazy Theodore's junkyard. 3 months ago, he'd been scraping together enough money to keep his struggling hiking guide business afloat, leading weekend warriors up the gentle trails around Millbrook while dreaming of the day he could afford to tackle the real mountains out west. Now he stood in the cramped office of Millbrook's only law firm, holding documents that made him responsible for 3 acres of what everyone agreed was worthless land. "Your great-uncle was quite specific about the conditions," said attorney Patricia Wells, adjusting her reading glasses as she reviewed the will one more time. "The property cannot be sold for a period of 1 year from the date of inheritance. During that time, you must personally visit the land at least once per week and maintain it according to county regulations." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the worn leather chair. What exactly does maintain it mean when we're talking about a junk lot? That's where it gets interesting. Patricia pulled out a thick folder marked Property Requirements, T. Sullivan. "Your uncle left very detailed instructions. You're to keep all existing structures and arrangements exactly as they are. Nothing is to be removed, relocated, or significantly altered without written permission from the county planning office." Structures. Marcus had driven past the property countless times over the years. All he'd ever seen was piles of rusted cars, old appliances, and what looked like random scrap metal arranged in no particular order. Patricia handed him a surveyor's map that showed the property, boundaries, and marked several areas as permanent. Installations. The map was covered with Theodore's handwriting, notes about drainage patterns, load-bearing considerations, and something called access points that made no sense to Marcus. "Your uncle was a mining engineer before he retired," Patricia explained. "Worked all over the country for 40 years. When he moved back to Millbrook, people expected him to buy one of the nice houses up on Hill Street. Instead, he purchased this land at the edge of town and started collecting things." Marcus studied the will more carefully. Theodore had been his grandfather's brother, but the family had lost touch decades ago. Marcus's parents had always spoken of Uncle Theodore as the eccentric relative who'd chosen isolation over family connections. The few times Marcus had seen him around town, Theodore had been a thin, bearded man who avoided eye contact and seemed to have conversations with himself. "Did he leave any explanation for why he wanted me to inherit this?" Marcus asked. "Just this." Patricia handed him a sealed envelope marked, "For Marcus Sullivan, open after reading will." Inside, Marcus found a single sheet of paper covered in Theodore's careful handwriting. "Marcus, you don't know me, but I've been watching your life from a distance. Your father spoke of your love for the outdoors, your honest character, and your struggles to build something meaningful with limited resources. I believe you are the right person to understand what I've spent 20 years protecting. The property holds more than what appears on the surface. Be patient, be observant, trust your instincts and trust your dog. The answers you seek are buried beneath what others see as worthless. When you're ready to dig deeper, look for the compass that points to more than just magnetic north." Theodore Marcus read the note twice, feeling more confused than enlightened. Compass? What compass? Patricia shrugged. Your uncle was known for speaking in riddles. The important thing legally is that you understand the terms. 1 year of ownership before you can sell, weekly visits, no major changes to the property. The taxes are current through the end of this year, but after that, they're your responsibility. As Marcus walked out of the law office with a manila folder full of documents, he felt the weight of unexpected responsibility settling on his shoulders. The property taxes alone would consume most of his savings, and there was no obvious way to generate income from 3 acres of junk. His hiking guide business barely covered his modest apartment rent and basic living expenses. That afternoon, Marcus drove Ranger out to take his first official look at his inheritance. The golden retriever had been his constant companion for 5 years, originally adopted as a hiking partner, but now more like family than pet. Ranger had an uncanny ability to sense things that escaped human attention. Dangerous weather approaching, unstable trail conditions, the mood of difficult clients. Standing at the property's front gate, Marcus tried to see what Theodore might have seen in this place. The land itself was relatively flat, bordered by mature oak trees and a small creek that ran along the back edge. Under different circumstances, it might have made a nice spot for a cabin or small farm. Instead, it looked like the final resting place for every broken appliance and rusted vehicle in 3 counties. Marcus had waited 3 days to return to the property, partly from reluctance and partly because he needed to borrow a decent flashlight from his neighbor. Now standing beside the overturned washing machine where Ranger had made his discovery, Marcus felt his heart racing in a way that reminded him of his first solo climb up Devil's Peak. The concrete steps descended at a steep angle, disappearing into darkness that his flashlight beam couldn't fully penetrate. The construction was solid, professional, nothing like the haphazard arrangement of junk scattered across the surface. Someone had spent considerable time and money building whatever lay beneath Theodore's carefully maintained facade. "Stay close, boy," Marcus whispered to Ranger, who was already halfway down the steps, his tail wagging with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for discovering new hiking trails. The stairway was longer than Marcus had expected, descending at least 12 feet before opening into a chamber that made him stop and stare. The space was roughly 20 feet square, with reinforced concrete walls and a ceiling supported by steel beams that looked like they could hold up a building. Battery-powered LED lights mounted along the walls flickered to life as he moved, triggered by motion sensors that suggested this place had been designed for regular use, but it was what covered the walls that truly captured Marcus's attention. Every surface was lined with maps, charts, and diagrams, all meticulously hand-drawn and labeled in Theodore's precise script. Some showed the surface layout of the property, marking every pile of junk and scrap metal with mathematical precision. Others depicted underground features, water tables, rock formations, and what looked like geological survey data that meant nothing to Marcus, but had clearly been important to Theodore. In the center of the room sat a sturdy wooden table covered with more papers, and there, exactly as Theodore's letter had suggested, lay a brass compass unlike any Marcus had ever seen. The instrument was beautifully crafted, with an ornate face that showed not just the standard directional markings, but also a series of numbers and symbols etched around the rim. When Marcus picked it up, he noticed immediately that the needle didn't point north. Instead, it swung steadily toward the back wall of the chamber. Ranger had discovered something else, pawing excitedly at a metal filing cabinet tucked into one corner. The top drawer was unlocked, filled with manila folders labeled with dates going back 15 years. Marcus pulled out the most recent file and found detailed photographs of the property taken from various angles, showing the gradual accumulation of junk that had transformed the land from ordinary to bizarre. But these weren't random snapshots. Each photograph was annotated with measurements and compass bearings, documenting the precise placement of every major item on the surface. What Marcus had assumed was the chaotic collection of a hoarder was actually a carefully planned arrangement. Each piece of junk positioned according to some system that Theodore had spent years perfecting. One photograph particularly caught Marcus's attention, an aerial view that must have been taken from a helicopter or small plane, showing the property from directly above. From this perspective, the scattered junk formed a pattern that was invisible from ground level. Lines of rusted cars and appliance piles created what looked almost like arrows or markers, all pointing toward the back corner of the property where the creek ran closest to the tree line. "What were you trying to tell people, Uncle Theodore?" Marcus murmured, studying the aerial photograph more carefully. Ranger barked once, a sharp sound that echoed in the concrete chamber. He was standing beside another door that Marcus hadn't noticed initially, partially hidden behind a tall filing cabinet. This door was steel, painted the same grey as the concrete walls, and secured with a combination lock that looked new compared to everything else in the room. Marcus tried the compass again, watching as its needle swung toward this second door with unwavering certainty. Whatever Theodore had been protecting, whatever secret justified 20 years of pretending to be the town eccentric, it lay beyond that locked door. The combination lock had 4 digits. Marcus tried the obvious choices: Theodore's birth year, the year he'd moved back to Millbrook, the current year, but none worked. Then he remembered the numbers etched around the rim of the compass, starting with the first sequence that lined up with the needle's current position. Marcus carefully entered the digits. 1847. The lock clicked open, with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the underground chamber. Behind the steel door lay another stairway, this one carved directly into the bedrock and extending even deeper into the earth. A cool draft rose from the darkness below, carrying scents that Marcus couldn't identify, but that made Ranger whine softly and press closer to his legs. Marcus clipped the compass to his belt and checked his flashlight battery. Whatever Theodore had been hiding, whatever had required this elaborate deception and careful planning, they were about to discover it together. The second stairway descended much deeper than the first, carved directly into living rock that showed the careful work of someone who understood both geology and construction. Marcus's flashlight revealed tool marks on the stone walls, not the rough scraping of amateur excavation, but the precise cuts of professional mining equipment. Theodore had clearly invested serious money and expertise into whatever lay at the bottom of this passage. After what felt like several minutes of careful descent, the stairway opened into a chamber that took Marcus's breath away. This room was enormous, easily 40 feet wide and stretching beyond the reach of his flashlight beam. But more impressive than its size was what covered every inch of the walls. Hand-drawn maps, hundreds of them. Some showed the local area around Millbrook with incredible detail, not just roads and buildings, but elevation changes, water sources, soil types, and geological features that didn't appear on any official survey. Others depicted underground formations that Marcus could barely comprehend, cross-sections showing rock layers, mineral deposits, and what looked like natural cave systems extending for miles beneath the surrounding countryside. But it was the largest map, covering the entire back wall of the chamber, that made Marcus understand the true scope of Theodore's work. This masterpiece showed the property itself in extraordinary detail, with every surface feature accurately represented, but also revealing what lay beneath. Underground, the map showed a network of natural cavities and mineral veins that transformed the seemingly worthless junk lot into something entirely different. Ranger had found another table, this one larger than the first and covered with what appeared to be official documents. Marcus approached cautiously, his flashlight revealing papers that looked far more professional than Theodore's hand-drawn maps. These were geological surveys, mineral assay reports, and legal documents bearing the letterheads of mining companies and government agencies. The first document Marcus examined was a mineral rights assessment dated just 3 years ago. The technical language was largely beyond him, but certain phrases jumped out with startling clarity. Exceptional concentrations of rare earth elements, estimated extractable value, and most shocking of all, preliminary assessment suggests deposits worth $40 to $60 million. Marcus sank into the folding chair beside the table, his legs suddenly unsteady. $60 million. The number seemed impossible, completely disconnected from the reality of rusted cars and broken appliances that he'd inherited. But the documents appeared legitimate: official seals, professional formatting, detailed chemical analyses that filled pages with numbers and scientific terminology. A second report, from a different company, confirmed the first assessment and added disturbing details. This mining corporation had been attempting to acquire Theodore's property for over a decade, increasing their offers year by year as their geological data became more precise. The final offer, made just 6 months before Theodore's death, was for $12 million, apparently far less than the true value of what lay beneath the ground. Theodore had rejected every offer. More documents revealed the pressure Theodore had faced. Legal threats, attempts to claim eminent domain, and what appeared to be harassment from corporate representatives who couldn't understand why an elderly man would refuse such substantial offers. One letter marked "Final Notice" threatened legal action if Theodore didn't respond to their generous proposal within 30 days. The date on that letter was just 2 weeks before Theodore's death. Marcus found Theodore's responses filed carefully in a separate folder. His great-uncle's letters were polite but firm, explaining that the property was not for sale at any price and requesting that all further contact cease. But in a personal note clipped to one of the rejection letters, Theodore had written something that made Marcus's chest tighten. "They don't understand that some things are more valuable than money. This land holds more than minerals. It holds responsibility." The brass compass had continued to pull steadily in one direction, and now Marcus followed its guidance to a section of the chamber where Theodore had created what could only be described as a shrine to the land itself. Photographs covered a bulletin board, not the aerial survey shots from upstairs, but intimate pictures of the property through the seasons. Marcus saw the creek running clear in spring, the oak trees brilliant with fall colors, and wildlife that had found sanctuary in the supposedly worthless junk lot. Among these photographs, Marcus found pictures of himself. Recent pictures. Theodore had been watching him, documenting his hiking business, his relationship with Ranger, even his financial struggles. One photo showed Marcus leading a group of elderly hikers up the gentle trail to Miller's Lookout, his face animated as he pointed out native wildflowers. Another captured him, sharing his lunch with Ranger during a rest break, both of them silhouetted against a sunset that painted the valley in gold. In Theodore's handwriting beneath this last photo, "He understands what matters. He will know what to do." Marcus studied the mineral assessment reports again, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Theodore had entrusted to him. $40 to $60 million worth of rare earth deposits lay beneath the junk lot, protected by nothing more than Theodore's stubborn refusal to sell and an inheritance, law that gave Marcus 1 year to decide the property's fate. But as he looked at Theodore's photographs and remembered the old man's note about responsibility, Marcus began to understand that his great-uncle hadn't just left him money. He'd left him a choice that would define not just his own future, but the future of the land itself. Behind the bulletin board of photographs, Marcus discovered a leather portfolio that had been carefully preserved in a protective plastic sleeve. The cover was embossed with Theodore's initials and a date from 15 years earlier, around the time he'd first purchased the property and begun his elaborate deception. Inside, Theodore's personal journal revealed a story that was both more complex and more human than Marcus had imagined. The entries began with the clinical observations of a mining engineer assessing a potential site, but gradually evolved into something deeper, the reflections of a man grappling with responsibility, legacy, and the unintended consequences of discovery. Day 1, initial survey complete. Preliminary core samples exceed all expectations. This could be the largest rare earth deposit discovered in North America in the past decade. Need to file formal claims before word spreads. The early entries read like technical reports, focused on extraction potential and profit margins. But by the third month, Theodore's tone had changed. Received first offer from Consolidated Mining. 47 million for full mineral rights. Should be celebrating, but can't stop thinking about what industrial extraction would do to this place. Drove through their Colorado site last week. Nothing left but moonscape and poisoned groundwater. Marcus flipped through pages of increasingly conflicted observations. Theodore had researched every major rare earth mining operation in the country, documenting environmental damage that lasted decades after the valuable minerals were exhausted. Strip mining, chemical processing, contaminated watersheds. The true cost of extraction went far beyond the initial disruption. The creek supports a family of beavers and at least 12 species of migratory birds, Theodore had written. Found Indian artifacts near the oak grove. This land has been providing for people for centuries. Do I have the right to destroy that for money I don't even need? The journal revealed Theodore's gradual transformation from profit-minded engineer to reluctant guardian. He'd begun accumulating the junk that would eventually cover the property, initially as camouflage to discourage casual exploration, but later as part of a more sophisticated strategy. The junk serves multiple purposes, one entry explained. Surface cover prevents aerial surveying. Scattered metal interferes with ground-penetrating radar, and the general appearance discourages anyone from looking closely. Most importantly, the township classified it as developed land, which complicates any future mining permits. Marcus found technical drawings showing how Theodore had positioned the surface junk to maximum strategic advantage. Rusted cars formed barriers that would make heavy equipment access difficult. Appliance piles created visual obstacles that broke up sightlines from neighboring properties. Even the seemingly random placement followed engineering, principles designed to complicate any future extraction efforts. But the journal also revealed Theodore's growing isolation and the personal cost of his deception. People in town think I've lost my mind. Maybe they're right. Turned down another offer today, this one for 63 million. Patricia Wells looked at me like I needed psychiatric evaluation. How do you explain that some things shouldn't be disturbed, regardless of their market value? The entries from recent years showed Theodore's increasing concern about his own mortality and the future of his secret. He'd researched his surviving relatives, eventually focusing on Marcus not just as a potential heir, but as someone whose character might be suited to the burden of stewardship. Watched Marcus Sullivan lead a group of seniors up Miller's Trail today, patient with the slower hikers, knowledgeable about local ecology, respectful of the land. His business is struggling, but he still refuses to take groups into sensitive wildlife areas during nesting season. Money isn't his primary motivation. Maybe he's the right choice. The final entries, written just weeks before Theodore's death, revealed his ultimate plan. Legal structure is in place. 1-year inheritance restriction gives him time to understand what he's inherited without immediate pressure to make permanent decisions. If he's the man I think he is, he'll find a way to protect the land while still benefiting from its value. If not, at least I've bought the creek another year of clean water. Marcus closed the journal with hands that weren't quite steady. Theodore hadn't just left him money, he'd left him a moral puzzle with no easy answers. The mineral deposits were worth enough to secure financial independence for life, but extraction would destroy everything Theodore had spent 15 years protecting. Ranger had settled beside Marcus's chair, his warm presence comforting in the underground chamber, surrounded by the evidence of Theodore's long struggle. The golden retriever seemed to sense the weight of the decisions ahead, offering the kind of uncomplicated loyalty that Theodore had clearly valued in his final years. In the back of the journal, Marcus found a sealed envelope marked Emergency Contacts. Inside were business cards and phone numbers for environmental lawyers, sustainable mining consultants, and conservation organizations that Theodore had apparently researched as potential allies. Even in death, he was still trying to guide Marcus towards solutions that might satisfy both financial necessity and environmental responsibility. But at the bottom of the list, in Theodore's careful handwriting, was a note that made Marcus's decision infinitely more complex. Corporate surveillance began 3 months ago. They know the property's value, and they're watching for any sign that I'm ready to sell. Be careful who you trust. The safe was hidden behind what appeared to be a natural rock formation, but Marcus's flashlight revealed the subtle seam where Theodore had constructed a false wall that perfectly matched the surrounding stone. The brass compass pointed directly toward it, and when Marcus pressed against a specific point that Theodore had marked with a small carved symbol, the rock face swung inward on hidden hinges. Inside the concealed safe, Marcus found the documents that transformed his inheritance from family curiosity to legitimate fortune. Professional assay reports from 3 independent geological firms, each confirming extraordinary concentrations of rare earth elements throughout the property. The technical language was dense, but the bottom-line numbers were unmistakable. Conservative estimates placed the extractable value at $52 million, with optimistic projections reaching as high as $80 million. But these weren't Theodore's only copies. The safe contained originals and duplicates of every document, carefully organized in waterproof containers that would preserve the evidence regardless of what happened to the underground chambers. Theodore had been thorough in ways that spoke to both his engineering background and his awareness that powerful interests might someday challenge his claims. Most recent assay report was dated just 4 months before Theodore's death, commissioned from a firm in Denver that specialized in rare earth assessments. Their analysis included detailed recommendations for extraction methods, environmental impact mitigation, and market timing that would maximize the value of the deposits. Reading between the professional language, Marcus understood that Theodore had been preparing for something, perhaps his own mortality. Perhaps a final confrontation with the corporations that had been pressuring him for years. Among the geological reports, Marcus found correspondence that revealed the true scope of corporate interest in Theodore's property. Consolidated Mining wasn't the only company that had identified the deposits. At least 4 major corporations had conducted their own surveys, using satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and what the letters euphemistically called preliminary site assessment to confirm the presence of valuable minerals. One letter, from a corporation called Terra Dynamics, included aerial photographs that clearly showed the property from above, with computerized analysis identifying mineral signatures visible through multispectral imaging. The technology was sophisticated enough to penetrate Theodore's junk camouflage, revealing the geological formations beneath with startling clarity. But the most disturbing document was a legal analysis commissioned by Consolidated Mining, exploring options for acquiring the property through eminent domain proceedings. The report outlined strategies for convincing local authorities that rare earth extraction served compelling public interests, particularly given increasing demand for elements essential to renewable energy technology and national defense applications. Subject property represents strategic national resource, the legal brief argued. Continued private ownership prevents access to materials critical for energy independence and economic security. Recommend coordination with federal agencies to establish extraction as matter of national priority. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as he realized the implications. These corporations weren't just interested in making profit, they were preparing to use government power to force the sale if necessary. Theodore's year-long inheritance. Restriction might not provide the protection it seemed to offer, The safe contained one more category of documents that changed. Everything Marcus thought he understood about his great-uncle. Theodore hadn't been working alone. The correspondence revealed a network of allies that included environmental lawyers, sustainable mining specialists, and conservation organizations that had been quietly supporting his efforts to protect the property. Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of environmental engineering at the State University, had been consulting with Theodore on extraction methods that could minimize ecological damage while still accessing the valuable deposits. Her letters outlined innovative approaches that could extract significant mineral value while preserving the creek ecosystem and surrounding wildlife habitat. Traditional strip mining would indeed be environmental disaster, Dr. Chen had written. However, selective extraction using precision drilling could access primary deposits while leaving surface ecosystem intact. Revenue would be lower but still substantial, possibly 30 to 40 million over extended timeline. Another ally, attorney Michael Reeves, specialized in conservation law and had been preparing legal frameworks that could protect the property while still allowing Theodore to benefit from its mineral wealth. His letters outlined trust, structures and conservation easements that could permanently prevent destructive mining while generating sustainable income from carefully managed extraction. But the most encouraging correspondence came from the Millbrook Creek Watershed Alliance, a local environmental group that had been quietly monitoring water quality in the area and documenting the ecological value of Theodore's property. They had been prepared to support him in any legal battles with mining corporations, providing both expert testimony and public advocacy. Your property serves as critical habitat for 17 species of native birds and provides filtration for approximately 40% of Millbrook's drinking water supply, their coordinator had written. Environmental impact of large-scale mining would extend far beyond property boundaries, affecting entire watershed. As Marcus absorbed the magnitude of support that Theodore had assembled, he began to understand that his great-uncle's apparent isolation had been another form of camouflage. Far from being a lone eccentric, Theodore had been the center of a carefully organized effort to protect something valuable from those who would destroy it for profit. Ranger whined softly from beside the safe, drawing Marcus's attention to a final manila envelope marked "For Marcus, open only when ready." Inside, Marcus found a business plan that took his breath away. The business plan that Theodore had prepared was unlike anything Marcus had expected. Instead of simple extraction strategies or environmental protection arguments, his great-uncle had designed a comprehensive approach that could satisfy multiple stakeholders while generating substantial revenue over an extended timeline. The Millbrook Creek Conservation and Development Project, the cover page read, a model for sustainable rare earth extraction. The proposal was professionally formatted and thoroughly researched, clearly intended for presentation to government agencies, environmental groups and potential investors. Theodore's plan called for selective extraction using precision drilling, techniques that could access the primary mineral deposits while leaving 90% of the surface ecosystem undisturbed. The projected revenue was lower than full-scale mining would generate, $35 million over 15 years instead of $60 million in 3 years. But the approach would preserve the creek, protect wildlife habitat, and maintain the property's value as natural space. More importantly, the plan included provisions that would benefit the entire Millbrook community. A percentage of extraction revenue would fund a permanent conservation endowment, ensuring long-term protection for the surrounding watershed. Local hiring preferences would provide employment for residents, while educational partnerships would establish the site as a demonstration project for sustainable mining practices. But as Marcus read deeper into Theodore's proposal, he found evidence of the forces that had been working against such reasonable compromises. Attached to the business plan were contracts that various corporations had attempted to force Theodore to sign, agreements that would have stripped him of all control over extraction methods while providing minimal environmental protections. Consolidated Mining's proposed contract was particularly egregious. They offered $47 million for complete mineral rights, but the fine print revealed that Theodore would have no oversight of extraction methods, no guarantee of environmental remediation, and no legal recourse if the company's activities damaged surrounding properties. The contract also included non-disclosure agreements that would have prevented Theodore from publicly discussing the environmental impact of mining operations. Terra Dynamics had offered slightly better terms, $51 million with nominal environmental oversight, but their contract included clauses that effectively transferred responsibility for any ecological damage to Theodore personally. If mining operations contaminated the creek or damaged neighboring properties, Theodore would face unlimited liability for cleanup costs that could exceed the sale price of the land. The documents revealed corporate strategies that went beyond simple financial pressure. Marcus found evidence of attempts to manipulate local government, with mining companies offering substantial donations to municipal projects in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. One letter from Consolidated Mining to the Millbrook City Council proposed funding a new community center and upgraded water treatment facility, contingent upon the city's support for reclassifying Theodore's property as industrial land suitable for mineral extraction. Even more disturbing were the personal investigations that corporations had conducted into Theodore's background, financial situation, and family relationships. A private investigator's report, apparently obtained through Theodore's attorney, detailed surveillance activities that included monitoring Theodore's daily routines, tracking his correspondence, and even interviewing neighbors about his mental state and decision-making capacity. Subject exhibits increasing isolation and eccentric behavior consistent with early-stage dementia, one report claimed. Family members expressed concern about his judgment regarding property decisions. Recommend pursuing legal guardianship proceedings if voluntary sale negotiations continue to fail. Marcus felt a surge of anger reading these violations of his great-uncle's privacy. Theodore hadn't been developing dementia. He'd been protecting himself and his land from predatory corporations that would stop at nothing to access his mineral deposits. The eccentric behavior was actually careful strategy, designed to maintain his legal rights while building support for sustainable alternatives. The final section of documents revealed how close these corporate pressures had come to succeeding. Just 6 months before his death, Theodore had faced a coordinated assault that included legal challenges to his property rights, attempts to have him declared mentally incompetent, and threats of eminent domain proceedings that would force the sale regardless of his wishes. A letter from attorney Michael Reeves, dated 3 months before Theodore's death, outlined the gravity of the situation. Corporate pressure has escalated beyond normal business negotiations. They're now pursuing legal strategies that could override your property rights entirely. We need to accelerate protective measures and ensure your heir is prepared for what they'll inherit. This letter was followed by Theodore's response, written in his increasingly shaky handwriting. Marcus Sullivan represents our best hope. His character assessment is complete, legal framework is in place, and support network is prepared to assist him. If these corporations think they can intimidate a young man who spent his life leading people through dangerous terrain, they're going to learn otherwise. Marcus found Theodore's confidence both inspiring and daunting. His great-uncle had clearly spent considerable time studying Marcus's background, but Marcus wasn't sure he possessed the skills necessary to navigate complex corporate warfare while making decisions that would affect an entire ecosystem. The brass compass continued to pull steadily toward unexplored sections of the underground chamber, suggesting that Theodore's revelations weren't yet complete. But Marcus already understood that his inheritance came with enemies who commanded resources and legal expertise far beyond anything he'd ever encountered. Theodore had bought him 1 year of protection through the inheritance restrictions, but after that Marcus would face the full power of corporations that viewed his property as a strategic asset worth acquiring by any means necessary. Marcus emerged from the underground chambers after spending nearly 4 hours studying Theodore's documents, his mind reeling from everything he'd discovered. The late afternoon sun felt harsh after the artificial lighting below, and Ranger immediately trotted to the creek for a long drink, as if he too needed to process what they'd found. Beneath the junk lot, the collection of newspaper, clippings in Theodore's final filing cabinet told a different story than the one Marcus remembered from his childhood. What he'd always heard, described as his great-uncle's increasing eccentricity, was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign of misdirection that had lasted nearly 2 decades. The earliest articles, from when Theodore first purchased the property, described him as a distinguished mining engineer who had returned home to Millbrook after a successful career in mineral extraction. The local newspaper had even run a feature story about Theodore's plans to develop the land, possibly for a small residential community that would take advantage of the creek frontage and mature trees. But within 6 months, the tone of coverage had shifted dramatically. "Local man begins collecting junk on scenic property," read one headline. "Neighbors complain about eyesore," declared another. The articles painted Theodore as an increasingly isolated figure whose behavior was becoming a source of community concern and property value anxiety. Marcus now understood that every seemingly crazy decision had been calculated for maximum effect. Theodore had carefully timed the arrival of each junk delivery to coincide with town council meetings or county planning sessions, ensuring that officials would associate his property with chaos and worthlessness rather than valuable minerals. He'd even cultivated relationships with local scrap dealers, paying them to deliver their most unsightly refuse directly to his land. One article from 5 years ago included quotes from neighbors that revealed the effectiveness of Theodore's deception. "It's heartbreaking to see what's happened to him," said Mrs. Henderson, who lived on the adjacent street. "He used to be such a distinguished gentleman, but now he spends his days rearranging piles of garbage like they're precious treasures." Another neighbor had been more blunt. "The county should condemn that property. It's an environmental hazard and a disgrace to our community." I don't know what happened to Theodore Sullivan's mind, but he's clearly not capable of maintaining property in a responsible manner. These comments stung Marcus, even as he recognized their strategic value. Theodore had sacrificed his reputation and social relationships to protect something he believed was more important than community approval: the transformation from respected engineer to town. Eccentric had been a deliberate performance designed to discourage anyone from looking too closely at what lay beneath the surface chaos. The most revealing article had appeared in the Millbrook Gazette just 8 months before Theodore's death. "Mining companies express interest in local properties," described a regional survey that had identified several sites with potential mineral value. The article mentioned Theodore's property only in passing, noting that preliminary assessments suggest limited commercial viability. Due to surface contamination and access difficulties, Marcus smiled grimly at the article's careful language. Theodore's junk camouflage had been so effective that even professional geological surveys had been misled about the property's true value. The surface contamination was nothing more than rusted metal and old appliances, easily removable once extraction began. But the surveying companies had apparently accepted the visual evidence at face value, just as Theodore had hoped they would. However, the final section of newspaper clippings revealed that Theodore's deception was beginning to fail. More recent articles mentioned increased commercial interest in properties along Millbrook Creek, with several mining companies conducting environmental assessments throughout the area. One article quoted a Consolidated Mining spokesperson saying that advanced geological survey techniques had identified previously overlooked mineral potential in several local properties. Marcus found a handwritten note from Theodore. Clipped to this final article, they're getting closer. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar are seeing through the surface camouflage. Time is running out for subtle approaches. That evening, Marcus called his friend Jake Morrison, who ran a small environmental consulting firm in the next county. Without revealing the full scope of what he'd discovered, Marcus asked about mining company tactics and local government relationships. "Those big corporations play hardball," Jake warned. "They've got lawyers, lobbyists, and enough money to make problems disappear. If they've identified something valuable on your property, they're not going to give up just because you're not interested in selling." What kind of pressure are we talking about? Everything from inflated property tax assessments to sudden zoning violations that require expensive compliance measures. They'll make owning the land so costly and complicated that selling starts to look like the only reasonable option. And if that doesn't work, they've got connections with city and county officials who can make life very difficult for uncooperative property owners. Jake's warning proved prescient sooner than Marcus expected. The next morning brought a certified letter from the Millbrook County Tax Assessor's office, informing Marcus that his property had been selected for comprehensive reassessment based on updated geological surveys and mineral potential analysis. The letter was signed by Patricia Wells, the same attorney who had read Theodore's will just weeks earlier. The corporate representatives arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, driving matching black SUVs that looked distinctly out of place in Millbrook's modest residential neighborhood. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as three men in expensive suits surveyed his property from the street, pointing at various sections of the junk lot while consulting tablets and making notes. Marcus had been expecting this visit ever since receiving the tax reassessment notice, but that didn't make the reality any less intimidating. These weren't local officials or small-time developers. Everything about their appearance and coordination suggested major corporate backing and serious intent. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 o'clock, punctual in a way that felt calculated to convey professionalism and authority. Marcus opened the door to find a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident smile that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm David Brennan from Terra Dynamics Corporation. These are my colleagues, Mr. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez. We were hoping we could discuss a business opportunity that might interest you." Marcus had rehearsed this moment, drawing on Theodore's journals and his own experience dealing with difficult clients during his hiking guide days. "I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm not interested in selling the property." Brennan's smile never wavered. "Of course, and we completely understand your attachment to family land. But perhaps we could come in and explain what we have in mind. I think you'll find our proposal addresses many of the concerns that prevented your great-uncle from moving forward with previous discussions." Against his better judgment, Marcus stepped aside to let them enter. Ranger immediately positioned himself between Marcus and the visitors, not growling but radiating the kind of protective tension that made his intentions clear. The three men arranged themselves in Marcus's living room with practiced efficiency, Brennan taking the lead while his colleagues flanked him like backup singers. Chen opened a laptop and began setting up a presentation, while Rodriguez produced a leather portfolio thick with documents. "Mr. Sullivan," Brennan began, "Terra Dynamics specializes in sustainable mineral extraction that benefits both property owners and local communities. We're not here to strip mine your land and disappear. We're here to offer a partnership that could provide long-term financial security while preserving the environmental features you clearly value." The presentation that followed was professionally polished and carefully crafted to address every objection Theodore had raised during years of previous negotiations. Terra Dynamics proposed selective extraction techniques that would minimize surface disruption, environmental remediation that would restore affected areas to natural condition, and revenue sharing that would provide Marcus with ongoing income rather than a simple buyout. Our offer reflects current market conditions for rare earth elements, Brennan explained, advancing to a slide that showed projected revenues. $75 million over 12 years, with guaranteed environmental restoration and no liability for cleanup costs. You would retain ownership of the surface rights and could continue using the property for any purpose compatible with limited subsurface operations. Marcus felt his breath catch. $75 million was substantially more than even Theodore's most optimistic projections had suggested. The terms appeared generous, addressing most of the concerns that had made previous corporate offers unacceptable, but he remembered Theodore's warnings about reading the fine print. I'd need to review any contracts with my attorney before making any decisions, Marcus said carefully. Absolutely, Rodriguez interjected, sliding the leather portfolio across the coffee table. These are preliminary agreements, just to give you a sense of our commitment to fair terms and environmental responsibility. Take all the time you need to review them. As the Terra Dynamics team prepared to leave, Brennan's demeanor shifted slightly, becoming more personal and direct. Mr. Sullivan, I want to be completely honest with you. Your great-uncle was a brilliant man, but he was also quite elderly when he made his final decisions about this property. The mineral extraction industry has evolved significantly in recent years. Technologies that didn't exist 5 years ago now make it possible to access valuable deposits while preserving surface ecosystems. He gestured toward the window that overlooked the junk lot. Theodore was protecting something that no longer needs protection. With modern techniques, you can benefit from your inheritance without destroying what he was trying to preserve. After they left, Marcus spent the rest of the day reviewing the contracts they'd provided. The documents were impressively thorough, addressing environmental concerns with language that seemed both specific and legally binding. Terra Dynamics promised to use minimal impact extraction techniques. It would provide comprehensive environmental monitoring and guarantee complete restoration of surface ecosystems upon completion of operations. But as Marcus compared the Terra Dynamics contracts to the corporate agreements Theodore had rejected, he noticed subtle differences that concerned him. The environmental protections, while extensive, included numerous exceptions for unforeseen geological conditions and technical modifications required by operational realities. The revenue guarantees were substantial but dependent on market conditions that Terra Dynamics would monitor and report unilaterally. Most troubling was a clause buried deep in the technical appendices. Property owner acknowledges that mineral extraction operations may require modification of surface features, including but not limited to creek relocation, vegetation removal, and soil restructuring necessary for equipment access and operational efficiency. Marcus realized that despite their polished presentation and environmental promises, Terra Dynamics was proposing essentially the same destructive extraction that Theodore had spent 15 years resisting. The language was more sophisticated and the financial terms more generous, but the ultimate result would be the same: the destruction of everything Theodore had tried to protect. That evening, Marcus found the business card that Theodore had left for Dr. Sarah Chen, the environmental engineering professor who had been consulting on sustainable extraction alternatives. It was time to contact Theodore's allies and learn whether there were real alternatives to the corporate proposals that sounded too good to be true. The brass compass led Marcus to one final chamber that he'd missed during his initial exploration. Hidden behind what appeared to be a natural rockfall, but was actually another of Theodore's carefully constructed camouflages. This deepest room was smaller than the others, more intimate, and clearly served as Theodore's private retreat during the difficult final months of his life. A comfortable chair sat beside a small table that held a reading lamp, several books on environmental law and sustainable development, and a leather-bound notebook that was different from Theodore's technical journals. This was personal writing, stream of consciousness thoughts that revealed the emotional toll of his long deception and the hope he'd placed in Marcus as his eventual successor. But it was what lay on the table beside the notebook that made Marcus's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. A manila envelope marked "For Marcus Sullivan, final instructions" contained a letter written in Theodore's increasingly unsteady handwriting. Dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My dear great-nephew," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have discovered what I spent 15 years protecting and have chosen to dig deeper rather than simply accepting the surface value of your inheritance. This gives me hope that I chose correctly when I decided to entrust this responsibility to you." Theodore's final letter was both confession and instruction, revealing details about his strategy that he hadn't recorded in his official journals. The junk lot camouflage hadn't been his first choice. Initially, he'd simply planned to refuse all corporate offers and wait for market conditions to change. But when mining companies began using satellite surveillance and advanced geological surveys to identify mineral deposits, regardless of property owners' cooperation, Theodore realized he needed more sophisticated protection. The corporations have resources that individual landowners cannot match, Theodore wrote. They can wait decades for the right opportunity, apply political pressure that overwhelms local resistance, and use legal strategies that bankrupt anyone who tries to fight them directly. The only way to protect something valuable from such forces is to make them believe it has no value at all. The letter revealed that Theodore's network of allies was more extensive than Marcus had realized. Dr. Sarah Chen at the State University was part of a research consortium that had been quietly developing extraction techniques that could access rare earth deposits without destroying surrounding ecosystems. Attorney Michael Reeves belonged to a legal cooperative that specialized in protecting landowners from corporate intimidation. Even the Millbrook Creek Watershed Alliance was connected to regional and national environmental organizations that could provide support for the right kind of fight. "I have spent 3 years preparing these people to help you," Theodore continued. "They understand what is at stake, and they are ready to act when you give them the signal. But you must be careful about timing and strategy. The corporations are watching, and they will move quickly once they realize their deception has failed." Theodore's letter included specific instructions that Marcus was to follow if he decided to pursue sustainable extraction rather than simply selling to the highest bidder. The first step was to contact Dr. Chen immediately and arrange a private meeting to review the technical feasibility of selective mining. The second was to engage Attorney Reeves to begin establishing legal protections that would prevent corporate interference. The third was to document everything. Every corporate contact, every pressure tactic, every attempt to manipulate local government as evidence for potential legal proceedings. But the most important instruction was also the most personal. Trust your instincts and trust your dog. Ranger has been with you through difficult terrain before, and he will help you navigate this challenge as well. The land speaks to those who listen, and animals hear it more clearly than humans who are distracted by money and power. As if responding to his name in Theodore's letter, Ranger moved closer to Marcus's chair and rested his head on Marcus's knee. The golden retriever had been unusually attentive since their discovery of the underground chambers, as if he understood that their lives were about to change in fundamental ways. Theodore's letter concluded with a revelation that transformed Marcus's understanding of his inheritance. "The mineral deposits are valuable, but they are not the most important thing I'm leaving you. What matters most is the choice itself, the opportunity to prove that individual conscience can triumph over corporate greed, that environmental protection and financial benefit are not mutually exclusive, and that ordinary people can make extraordinary decisions when they understand what is truly at stake. Attached to the letter was a key that Theodore identified as opening a safety deposit box at Millbrook First National Bank. Inside you will find documents that prove corporate surveillance of this property has been ongoing for more than 2 years. These companies know exactly what lies beneath the junk lot, and they are prepared to use any means necessary to acquire it. The evidence in that box will help you fight them, but only if you are prepared for a battle that may last months or years. Marcus folded Theodore's letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The weight of his great-uncle's trust settled on his shoulders like a pack before a long hike, substantial but manageable if he approached the challenge with proper preparation and respect. For the terrain ahead tomorrow, he would contact Dr. Sarah Chen and begin assembling the team that Theodore had spent years preparing. Tonight he would sit in this quiet, underground chamber and try to understand how a struggling hiking guide had become the guardian of something worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. Dr. Sarah Chen met Marcus at the Millbrook Creek trailhead early on a Saturday morning, arriving in a hybrid SUV loaded with scientific equipment that looked more suited to a research expedition than a casual property inspection. She was younger than Marcus had expected from Theodore's correspondence, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of focused energy that reminded him of his most dedicated hiking clients. "Theodore spoke about you often during our final meetings," she said, shaking Marcus's hand with a firm grip that suggested both physical strength and professional confidence. "He believed you were someone who would understand that protecting the land and benefiting from its resources don't have to be mutually exclusive goals." As they walked the perimeter of the property, Dr. Chen explained the environmental impact studies that Theodore had commissioned over the past 3 years. Her research team had documented 17 species of native birds that nested in the oak trees, a beaver family that had established a complex dam system along the creek, and soil conditions that filtered runoff from the surrounding agricultural areas before it entered the municipal water supply. "Traditional strip mining would destroy all of this," she said, pointing to a section where the creek formed a natural pool that reflected the morning sky. "But selective extraction using precision drilling could access the primary mineral deposits while preserving 90% of the surface ecosystem." Dr. Chen had brought topographical maps that showed the underground geology in extraordinary detail. The rare earth deposits were concentrated in 3 distinct zones, 2 of which lay beneath areas that could be accessed without disturbing the creek or the mature trees. The third zone, which contained approximately 30% of the total mineral value, lay directly beneath the most ecologically sensitive area. "This is where we face the real decision," she explained, spreading the maps on a flat section of rock beside the creek. "We could access the first 2 zones using directional drilling from a single surface location, probably near the back corner of your property where environmental impact would be minimal. That would generate perhaps $25 to $30 million in revenue over 10 years. Marcus studied the maps, trying to understand the technical details while processing the financial implications. Even the reduced extraction would provide more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, while preserving everything Theodore had fought to protect. "What about the third zone?" he asked. "That's the difficult choice. Accessing those deposits would require surface operations that would disrupt the creek ecosystem and remove several of the large oaks. The environmental damage would be significant but not irreversible. We could restore most of the habitat within 5 to 7 years after extraction was completed." Dr. Chen pulled out a thick folder containing environmental impact assessments that compared her selective extraction proposal to the full-scale mining that corporations like Terra Dynamics were planning. The difference was dramatic. Her approach would disturb less than 2 acres of surface area and could be completed using equipment that wouldn't require widening access roads or removing existing vegetation barriers. The corporate proposals assume that maximum profit extraction is the only acceptable outcome, she said. They're not interested in preserving anything that interferes with operational efficiency, regardless of its ecological value or community importance. As they hiked toward the oak grove, where Theodore's aerial photographs had shown the most significant wildlife activity, Dr. Chen shared details about the political pressure that had been building around rare earth mining throughout the region. Federal agencies were increasingly interested in domestic sources of elements critical to renewable energy technology, and several mining companies had been lobbying for relaxed environmental standards in the name of energy independence. Your property has become a test case, she warned. If corporations can force extraction here, despite environmental concerns and landowner resistance, it sets a precedent that will affect similar properties throughout the region. What you decide will influence how these battles play out for other families facing the same pressures. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than Marcus had anticipated. He'd thought his decision would affect only his own life and Theodore's legacy. But Dr. Chen was describing consequences that could influence environmental policy and corporate behavior across multiple states. At the Oak Grove, Dr. Chen set up equipment that could measure soil chemistry, groundwater flow patterns, and root system density. The data she collected would help determine exactly how selective extraction might be accomplished without damaging the trees that had been growing here for more than a century. Theodore asked me to give you this if you decided to pursue sustainable extraction, she said, handing Marcus a sealed envelope. He wanted you to understand the full scope of what you'd be taking on before making any final commitments. Inside the envelope, Marcus found photographs and documents that revealed the environmental destruction left behind by Terra Dynamics and consolidated mining at other sites. Poisoned groundwater, bare hillsides that hadn't recovered vegetation after a decade, and local communities dealing with health problems that mining companies refused to acknowledge or address. This is what happens when profit becomes the only consideration, Dr. Chen said quietly. Theodore spent 2 years visiting these sites and documenting the long-term consequences. He wanted you to see what you'd be preventing if you choose to. Fight for a better approach. The safety deposit box at Millbrook first. National Bank contained documents that transformed Marcus's understanding of how long and how intensively his property had been under corporate surveillance. Bank President Margaret Foster, who had known Theodore for decades, personally escorted Marcus to the vault and expressed her condolences about his great-uncle's death. Theodore was a careful man, though she said as Marcus signed the access forms. He visited this box at least once a month during his final year, usually adding documents, but sometimes just sitting here for an hour, reviewing everything he'd collected. Inside the metal box, Marcus found a chronological record of corporate interest that stretched back nearly 3 years. The earliest documents were satellite photographs of his property taken from multiple angles and different seasons, with computerized analysis identifying geological signatures that revealed the mineral deposits beneath Theodore's junk camouflage. But the surveillance had extended far beyond remote imaging. Private investigators hired by various mining companies had conducted extensive research into Theodore's personal history, financial situation, and family relationships. One report included photographs of Theodore's daily routines, shopping at the local grocery store, visiting the post office, eating lunch at the diner. Downtown, along with detailed notes about his conversations and social interactions. More disturbing were the psychological profiles that corporate consultants had developed based on their surveillance. These documents analyzed Theodore's personality, predicted his likely responses to different negotiation strategies, and recommended pressure tactics that might overcome his resistance to selling. Subject exhibits classic symptoms of late-life anxiety and social isolation, one profile claimed. Recommend emphasizing financial security and family welfare concerns. Secondary approach should focus on property maintenance burdens and declining physical capacity to manage large acreage. Marcus felt sick reading these clinical assessments of his great-uncle's mental state and motivations. Theodore hadn't been an isolated eccentric making irrational decisions. He'd been a thoughtful man under systematic psychological pressure from corporations that studied him like a laboratory specimen, but Theodore had been conducting his own surveillance, documenting corporate activities with the thoroughness of someone who understood that legal battles were won and lost on the basis of evidence. He'd hired a private investigator of his own, a former FBI agent named Robert Hayes, who specialized in corporate malfeasance and environmental crimes. Hayes's reports revealed a pattern of illegal activities that extended far beyond simple business negotiations. Mining companies had been using local intermediaries to purchase properties adjacent to targeted sites, gradually surrounding resistant landowners with corporate-controlled territory that could be used to apply indirect pressure. They'd also been monitoring telephone conversations, intercepting mail, and using electronic surveillance equipment to gather intelligence about Theodore's decision-making process. Most shocking were the documents showing coordination between mining companies and local government officials, county commissioners, zoning board members, and even some city council representatives had received substantial campaign contributions from corporations that were supposedly competing against each other for mineral extraction rights. The competition is largely theater, Hayes had written in one report. While these companies bid against each other publicly, they coordinate privately to ensure that acquisition costs remain within acceptable parameters and that resistant property owners face unified pressure, rather than being able to play one corporation against another. Theodore's private investigator had also uncovered evidence of more direct intimidation tactics. Property owners who refused to sell had experienced suspicious equipment breakdowns, mysterious zoning violations that required expensive corrections, and tax assessment challenges that created significant legal costs. One family had faced repeated break-ins at their rural property, with nothing stolen but clear evidence that someone was searching for documents or information. The final section of Theodore's collection contained the most valuable evidence, recorded conversations between corporate representatives discussing strategies that clearly violated both environmental laws and property rights protections. Hayes had apparently used sophisticated audio equipment to document meetings where mining executives discussed bribing local officials, manipulating environmental impact studies, and using legal harassment to force property sales. We need to move quickly on the Sullivan property, one recorded conversation revealed. Our geological surveys show it's the largest single deposit in the region, and if word gets out about the true value, we'll face competition from international extraction companies that can outbid us. Another conversation discussed plans to challenge Theodore's mental competency if he continued refusing their offers. The old man's behavior gives us grounds for a guardianship petition. We find a cooperative relative, get them appointed as his guardian, and suddenly we're negotiating with someone more reasonable about market realities. Marcus realized that these recordings represented powerful evidence of corporate conspiracy and illegal surveillance. But they also revealed the scope of resources and ruthlessness he would face if he decided to fight for Theodore's vision of sustainable extraction. Among the final documents in the safety deposit box, Marcus found a list of contact information for investigative journalists, environmental lawyers, and government officials who specialized in corporate accountability. Theodore had been preparing not just for legal battles, but for a public relations campaign that would expose the tactics being used against resistant property owners. Throughout the region, The last item in the box was a handwritten note from Theodore. The evidence exists to stop them, but only if someone is brave enough to use it. The choice is yours, but you won't face it alone. Attorney Michael Reeves met Marcus at a coffee shop 2 towns away from Millbrook, explaining that corporate surveillance made local meetings inadvisable until they could establish secure communication protocols. Reeves was a tall, angular man in his early 50s who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to fighting powerful opponents and occasionally winning. Theodore was right to be paranoid, Reeves said, reviewing the documents Marcus had brought from the safety deposit box. These corporations have been conducting military-style intelligence operations against civilian property owners. What you've inherited isn't just mineral rights. It's evidence of systematic criminal activity that could shut down their operations entirely. Reeves explained that the recorded conversations Theodore's investigator had captured were particularly valuable because they documented conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of federal surveillance laws. Any one of these charges could result in criminal prosecution, but the combination represented a pattern of racketeering that could invoke federal RICO statutes designed to combat organized crime. The question is whether you want to use this evidence defensively to protect your right to develop the property according to your own timeline, or offensively to expose their illegal activities and potentially shut down their regional operations entirely. Marcus studied the legal strategy that Reeves had prepared based on his conversations with Theodore during the final months of his great-uncle's life. The defensive approach focused on establishing conservation trusts and environmental protections that would make corporate extraction legally impossible while allowing Marcus to pursue sustainable mining. According to Dr. Chen's specifications, we create a legal framework that permanently protects the most sensitive ecological areas while designating specific zones for minimal impact extraction, Reeves explained. The corporations can't challenge environmental protections that were established by the property owner, especially when we can demonstrate that their proposed alternative would violate multiple federal environmental laws. The offensive strategy was more complex and potentially more rewarding, but also carried significant personal risks for Marcus. Using Theodore's evidence to expose corporate criminal activity could result in massive civil penalties against the mining companies, but it would also make Marcus a target for legal retaliation and possibly physical intimidation. Theodore collected enough evidence to destroy several of these companies, Reeves said. But whistleblowing cases can take years to resolve, and the corporations have resources to make your life very difficult during that time. They'll challenge every aspect of your property rights, tie up your assets in legal proceedings, and use media campaigns to portray you as an environmental extremist standing in the way of American energy independence. As they discussed strategy, Reeves shared intelligence about the broader political context that made Marcus's property particularly valuable to corporate interests. Recent changes in federal policy had prioritized domestic rare earth production as a matter of national security, creating regulatory advantages for companies that could demonstrate large-scale extraction capabilities. The corporations aren't just competing for profit, Reeves explained. They're positioning themselves for federal contracts that could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Your property represents the kind of major deposit that would qualify a company for preferential treatment in government procurement decisions. This revelation transformed Marcus's understanding of what he was facing. The pressure to sell wasn't just about one property or even one company's profit margins. It was about positioning in a strategic industry that had implications for national energy policy and international competitiveness. Reeves had brought a draft agreement that represented a third option, one that Theodore had been developing during his final months. Instead of selling to corporations or fighting them in extended legal battles, Marcus could license extraction rights to a consortium of smaller, environmentally responsible mining companies that would operate according to Dr. Chen's sustainable extraction protocols. This approach generates less revenue than full-scale extraction, probably 35 million over 15 years instead of 75 million in 5 years, but it maintains your control over how the work is done and ensures permanent environmental protections for the most sensitive areas. The licensing agreement included provisions that would make Marcus a partner rather than just a seller, giving him ongoing oversight of extraction activities and a share of profits that would continue for decades. More importantly, it established legal precedents that could influence how similar properties throughout the region were developed. Theodore believed that demonstrating successful, sustainable extraction would be more valuable than any single property sale, Reeves said. If you can prove that environmental protection and resource development are compatible, it changes the entire conversation about mining policy and corporate responsibility. As Marcus reviewed the licensing agreement, he realized that Theodore had essentially designed a business model that could transform the entire rare earth extraction industry. Instead of accepting that environmental destruction was the inevitable cost of accessing valuable minerals, Marcus could demonstrate that smaller-scale, longer-term approaches could generate substantial profits while preserving ecological integrity. But the decision would commit him to years of careful oversight, ongoing legal battles with larger corporations, and the responsibility of proving that individual property owners could successfully challenge entire industries when armed with good evidence and better principles. Ranger, who had been sleeping quietly beside Marcus's chair, suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the coffee shop entrance. A moment later, 2 men in business suits entered and took a table with a clear view of where Marcus and Reeves were sitting. "Time to go," Reeves said quietly, gathering the documents into his briefcase. Theodore warned that they would escalate surveillance once you started meeting with his allies. The escalation began 3 days after Marcus's meeting with attorney Reeves. He returned from a morning hike with Ranger to find that someone had been inside his house, though nothing appeared to be missing. The intrusion was subtle. Drawers closed slightly differently than he'd left them. Books on his desk rearranged in ways that suggested careful searching. And Theodore's documents moved just enough to indicate they'd been photographed or copied. More disturbing was what Ranger's behavior revealed. The golden retriever immediately began systematically sniffing every room, whining and pawing at locations where electronic devices might have been planted. Marcus had no training in counter-surveillance, but Ranger's agitation suggested that their privacy had been compromised in ways that went beyond simple document theft. The break-in was followed by a series of seemingly unrelated problems that Marcus recognized as harassment tactics from Theodore's research. His internet service was mysteriously interrupted for 3 days, with the provider claiming equipment problems that required extensive troubleshooting. His truck developed mechanical issues that 2 different mechanics couldn't identify, forcing him to rely on borrowed transportation while expensive diagnostic tests revealed nothing definitively wrong. Most concerning was the sudden interest from county officials in his property, maintenance and compliance with local ordinances. Code enforcement officers appeared without warning to inspect everything from his septic system to his compliance with agricultural zoning requirements, finding technical violations that required immediate correction and substantial expense. You're in violation of County Ordinance 47B regarding accumulation of non-vehicular materials on residential property, announced Inspector Williams, a thin man with clipboard and camera who documented every pile of Theodore's carefully arranged junk. You have 30 days to remove all materials not specifically permitted under agricultural law. Residential use classifications. Marcus realized that forcing him to clear Theodore's surface camouflage was a strategic move designed to expose the property's true geology to more sophisticated surveillance. Without the metal and debris that had interfered with ground-penetrating radar, corporate surveys could map the underground mineral deposits with precision that would make legal challenges to extraction much more difficult. But Theodore had anticipated this possibility. Among his final instructions, Marcus found detailed plans for legal challenges to any orders requiring removal of the surface materials. The junk lot had been carefully documented as an intentional land management strategy designed to prevent erosion, control invasive vegetation, and provide wildlife habitat that supported protected species. The accumulated materials serve specific environmental functions, Theodore had written. Removal would constitute habitat destruction that violates both state and federal environmental protection laws. Any enforcement action must be challenged immediately using the precedent cases I've documented. Marcus called Attorney Reeves from a payphone outside the county courthouse, explaining the escalating pressure and asking for guidance about when to deploy Theodore's evidence of corporate criminal activity. "They're accelerating their timeline," Reeves observed. "Something has changed in their strategic calculation, possibly political pressure from federal agencies or competition from international mining interests. They're no longer willing to wait for normal business negotiations." Reeves had been conducting his own investigation into the corporations pressuring Marcus, uncovering financial connections that revealed why they were coordinating their efforts despite supposedly being competitors. Terra Dynamics and Consolidated Mining were both subsidiaries of the same international conglomerate, making their competitive bidding nothing more than theater designed to prevent Marcus from leveraging one offer against another. "It's time to go public with what we know," Reeves advised. "Theodore's evidence of illegal surveillance and bribery is strong enough to trigger federal investigations that could freeze their operations for months or years. But once we file complaints with the FBI and EPA, you become a protected whistleblower under federal law, which means they can't retaliate against you without facing additional criminal charges." That afternoon, Marcus drove to the State University to meet again with Dr. Chen, who had been developing more detailed plans for sustainable extraction based on her analysis of the property's geology and ecosystem. But when he arrived at her office, he found it empty, with a sign indicating that Dr. Chen was on indefinite administrative leave pending university review of research protocols. Her research assistant, a graduate student named Tom Bradley, met Marcus in the parking lot and explained what had happened. Dr. Chen received notice yesterday that her research funding was being suspended pending investigation of alleged conflicts of interest, Tom said. The university claims that her consulting work with private property owners violates academic independence policies, but the complaint was filed by a mining industry association that donated $5 million to the university's engineering program last year. Marcus realized that the corporations were systematically eliminating his support network, using their financial influence to silence academic researchers, legal advisors, and environmental advocates who might help him resist their pressure. Theodore's carefully assembled team of allies was being dismantled through tactics that were technically legal but ethically questionable, but Tom Bradley had risked his own academic career to ensure that Dr. Chen's research wouldn't disappear. "Entirely, Dr. Chen asked me to give you this if anything happened to her," he said, handing Marcus a flash drive. "It contains all her geological data and extraction proposals, plus contact information for researchers at other universities who might be willing to help. She said to tell you that the research is solid and the sustainable extraction approach will work if you can protect yourself long enough to implement it." The formal legal battle began when Marcus refused to comply with the county's order to clear Theodore's junk lot within the required 30 days. Attorney Reeves filed a comprehensive challenge that included federal environmental protection claims, allegations of corporate influence on local government, and a whistleblower complaint that detailed the illegal surveillance and intimidation tactics documented in Theodore's evidence. The response from the mining corporations was swift and overwhelming. Within a week, Marcus faced lawsuits challenging his inheritance rights, his mental competency to manage the property, and his compliance with various environmental regulations that had apparently been selectively enforced against him. The legal papers arrived daily, each representing thousands of dollars in potential legal costs and months of depositions, hearings, and court appearances. They're using classic corporate litigation strategy, Reeves explained during an emergency meeting at his law office. File so many legal challenges simultaneously that the defendant runs out of money and time to fight them all effectively. Most individual property owners would be forced to settle within 6 months just to avoid bankruptcy from legal fees. But Theodore's preparation extended to this scenario as well. The safety deposit box had contained not just evidence of corporate crimes, but also a legal defense fund that Theodore had been building for 3 years. The account held nearly $200,000 specifically designated for fighting the legal battles that Theodore knew Marcus would face. "Your great-uncle understood that justice is expensive," Reeves said. "This fund will cover legal costs for approximately 18 months, which should be long enough to exhaust their initial litigation strategy and force them to negotiate more reasonable terms." The federal whistleblower complaint generated immediate interest from both the FBI and the Environmental Protection Agency. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh contacted Marcus directly, explaining that Theodore's evidence of corporate surveillance and bribery had triggered a multi-agency investigation that could result in criminal charges against several mining company executives. "Your great-uncle documented a pattern of illegal activity that extends far beyond your property," Agent Walsh explained during their first meeting. "We're seeing evidence of systematic intimidation of property owners throughout the region, illegal surveillance operations, and coordination between supposedly competing companies to fix acquisition prices. This is exactly the kind of corporate criminal conspiracy that federal RICO statutes were designed to address." The investigation provided Marcus with legal protections that made direct retaliation much more difficult. For the mining corporations, federal whistleblower laws prohibited any actions that could be construed as punishment for his cooperation with law enforcement, effectively freezing the corporate litigation campaign while the criminal investigation proceeded. But the corporations adapted their strategy, shifting from direct legal pressure to public relations campaigns designed to portray Marcus as an environmental extremist standing in the way of American energy independence. Local newspapers began running editorials about the economic benefits that rare earth extraction could provide to Millbrook, highlighting job creation and tax revenue that would result from major mining operations. "Local man sits on fortune, while community struggles," read one headline in the Millbrook Gazette. The article quoted unnamed sources describing Marcus as selfish and out of touch with the economic realities facing working families in the region. The media campaign was sophisticated and well-funded, featuring interviews with mining industry experts who emphasized the national security importance of domestic rare earth production. Television advertisements showed American soldiers and renewable energy installations while describing how opposition to mining projects threatened both military readiness and climate change solutions. But the public relations offensive also generated unexpected support for Marcus's position. Environmental groups throughout the region began organizing to support sustainable extraction alternatives, while local residents who remembered Theodore's positive contributions to the community began questioning the sudden media attention on a property that had been ignored for decades. Agnes Murphy, Marcus's neighbor, became an unlikely ally in the public relations battle. Her letter to the editor of the Millbrook Gazette pointed out that Theodore had been a respected member of the community for decades and that his Property had never caused problems, until large corporations began pressuring his heir to sell. "I've lived next to that property for 15 years, Agnes wrote. Theodore Sullivan was a quiet, thoughtful man who kept his land neat and helped his neighbors whenever they needed assistance. Now suddenly we're supposed to believe that the same property that never bothered anyone is somehow a threat to national security. The real threat is from corporations that think they can bully individual property owners into giving up their rights. More surprisingly, Marcus received support from other property owners throughout the region who had faced similar corporate pressure. A network of families began sharing information about intimidation tactics, legal harassment, and media campaigns that seemed to follow identical patterns regardless of which mining company was involved. "They're not just after your property," explained Janet Morrison, whose family had been fighting Consolidated Mining's attempts to acquire their farm for 2 years. "They're trying to establish precedents that will make it impossible for any individual property owner to resist corporate acquisition when valuable resources are involved. What happens to your case will determine whether the rest of us have any rights at all." The stakes had expanded far beyond Theodore's original vision of protecting a single property. Marcus realized he was fighting for principles that would influence corporate behavior and property rights throughout the region, possibly throughout the country. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Marcus was reviewing the latest round of legal documents in Theodore's underground chamber when Ranger began pawing excitedly at a section of wall that they'd never examined closely. Behind what appeared to be solid concrete, Marcus discovered another hidden compartment containing Theodore's final strategic weapon, a complete recording system that had been documenting every conversation and meeting that took place on the property for the past 2 years. The digital recordings revealed the full scope of corporate infiltration and illegal surveillance that had been conducted against Theodore during his final years. More importantly, they captured recent conversations between corporate representatives who apparently hadn't realized that their activities on the property were being monitored and preserved. Among the most damaging recordings were meetings where Terra Dynamics executives discussed bribing county officials to expedite the property condemnation process, planning to contaminate the creek system to justify environmental emergency powers, and coordinating with federal officials to classify Marcus as a security threat who could be removed from his property under national defense provisions. The old man's been dead for months, but the nephew is becoming a bigger problem than we anticipated, one voice said during a recorded conversation that had taken place just outside Marcus's house. The whistleblower complaint has federal agencies asking uncomfortable questions, and the media campaign isn't generating the public support we expected, another voice, which Marcus recognized as belonging to David Brennan from Terra Dynamics, responded with chilling directness. Time to escalate to direct action. Make the property financially unsustainable. Create safety hazards that require county intervention. And if necessary, arrange incidents that demonstrate why individual property owners can't be trusted with resources this valuable to national security. Attorney Reeves called an emergency meeting when Marcus shared these recordings, explaining that they represented evidence of conspiracy to commit multiple federal crimes, including property destruction, endangering public safety, and abuse of national security classifications for commercial purposes. "This changes everything," Reeves said, reviewing transcripts of the most incriminating conversations. "We're no longer just defending your property rights. We're exposing a criminal conspiracy that threatens the constitutional foundations of private property protection." These recordings prove that corporations are using government power as a weapon on against individual citizens. The federal investigation expanded rapidly once Agent Walsh reviewed Theodore's surveillance recordings. Within days, search warrants were executed at Terra Dynamics offices in 3 states, while federal prosecutors began preparing criminal charges that could result in decades of prison time for corporate executives who had authorized illegal surveillance and intimidation operations. But the criminal investigation also accelerated corporate desperation. Marcus received a phone call from David Brennan offering terms that seemed too generous to believe. $90 million for immediate sale with no conditions regarding extraction methods or environmental protection. Mr. Sullivan, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about our intentions, Brennan said, his voice carrying none of the confidence Marcus remembered from their first meeting. Terra Dynamics is prepared to offer terms that exceed any previous proposals and address all of your concerns about environmental protection and community benefit. The offer included provisions that would fund a permanent environmental trust for the surrounding watershed, guarantee employment for local residents during extraction operations, and provide Marcus with ongoing royalty payments that would continue for decades after mining was completed. On paper, it seemed to satisfy every objection that Theodore had raised during years of refusing corporate proposals. Why the sudden generosity? Marcus asked. Let's just say that circumstances have changed in ways that make rapid resolution beneficial for all parties involved, Brennan replied. Legal proceedings can be expensive and unpredictable for everyone. We'd prefer to reach an agreement that satisfies your interests while allowing our project to move forward. After ending the call, Marcus realized that the corporation's desperation created an opportunity that Theodore might never have imagined. Instead of simply protecting his property from destructive extraction, Marcus could use the threat of criminal prosecution to force genuine environmental concessions that would transform how rare earth mining was conducted throughout the region. Attorney Reeves confirmed that federal prosecutors were interested in cooperation agreements that could reduce criminal penalties for corporate executives in exchange for industry-wide reforms that would protect property owners and environmental resources from the tactics that had been used against Theodore. They want to make an example that prevents this kind of corporate criminal activity from spreading to other industries, Reeves explained. If we can structure a settlement that includes permanent protections for environmentally sensitive properties, and guarantees sustainable extraction practices, it becomes a model that other regions can adopt. The final settlement agreement that emerged from negotiations between federal prosecutors, environmental advocates, and corporate legal teams went far beyond anything Theodore had envisioned when he first decided to protect his land from destructive mining. Marcus would retain ownership of his property while licensing extraction rights to a consortium that included both private companies and university research programs committed to developing environmentally responsible mining technologies. The financial terms provided Marcus with $38 million over 12 years, while establishing legal precedents that would protect other property owners throughout the region from the intimidation tactics that corporations had used against Theodore. 1 year after discovering the hidden chambers beneath Theodore's junk lot, Marcus stood beside the creek that had sparked his great-uncle's determination to protect the land from destructive mining. The property looked completely different now, but in ways that honored Theodore's vision, while embracing the possibilities he'd never lived to see. The sustainable extraction operation was elegant in its minimal impact. A single drilling site, carefully positioned behind the oak grove where it couldn't be seen from the road, housed precision equipment that could access the primary mineral. Deposits through directional boring that left the surface ecosystem essentially untouched. The technology was so advanced that most visitors to the property never realized that multi-million-dollar mining operations were taking place beneath their feet. Dr. Sarah Chen had been reinstated to her university position with expanded research, funding that allowed her to establish the Millbrook Creek Institute for Sustainable Resource Development. Her team of graduate students worked alongside mining engineers to refine extraction techniques that were now being studied by environmental organizations and government agencies throughout North America. "We're extracting approximately 12% of the total mineral value," Dr. Chen explained to the delegation of environmental lawyers who had come to document the project as a model for future property disputes. "But we're doing it in ways that actually improve surface ecosystem health while generating revenue that will continue for decades." The selective extraction approach had revealed something that full-scale strip mining would have destroyed. The mineral deposits were part of a larger geological formation that included natural groundwater filtration systems essential to regional water quality. Preserving the underground structure while accessing valuable minerals created environmental benefits that extended far beyond the property boundaries. Marcus had used his settlement funds to establish the Theodore Sullivan Environmental Trust, which now protected nearly 3,000 acres of watershed throughout the region, while providing ongoing support for sustainable mining research and legal defense for property owners facing corporate pressure. "Theodore would be amazed by what his stubbornness accomplished," said attorney Michael Reeves, who had become the Trust's legal director. "His refusal to accept that environmental protection and resource development were mutually exclusive has created a new model that's being adopted throughout the rare earth industry." The federal criminal investigation had resulted in guilty pleas from 17 corporate executives, including David Brennan and his colleagues at Terra Dynamics. More importantly, the prosecution had established legal precedents that made corporate surveillance and intimidation of property owners federal crimes punishable by substantial prison sentences. Agnes Murphy had become an unlikely celebrity as the neighbor who had supported Marcus throughout his battle with the mining corporations. Environmental organizations frequently invited her to speak at conferences about grassroots resistance to corporate pressure, though she insisted that her role had simply been helping a young man understand what his great-uncle had been trying to protect. "People think this was about money," Agnes told a reporter from National Geographic who was documenting the case for a feature story about sustainable mining. "But it was really about whether individual conscience can triumph over corporate greed when armed with good evidence and better principles." The property itself had been transformed into a demonstration site that attracted visitors from around the world. University researchers studied the integration of precision extraction with ecosystem preservation, while legal scholars examined how the case had established new protections for property owners facing pressure from resource extraction industries. But Marcus's favorite transformation was the memorial garden that had been established in the section of the property where Theodore's underground chambers remained hidden from casual visitors. Native plants that Theodore had been protecting now thrived in carefully tended beds, while interpretive signs explained the ecological importance of preserving natural systems alongside resource development. The brass compass that had guided Marcus to his first discoveries now rested in a place of honor in the memorial garden, its needle still pointing toward the oak grove where Theodore's vision had first taken root. Children from local schools came regularly to learn about environmental stewardship and the importance of asking difficult questions when powerful interests claimed that destructive approaches are the only viable options. Ranger, now graying around his muzzle but still energetic enough for their daily walks through the preserved sections of the property, had become something of a legend among the visitors who heard stories about the dog who discovered a secret worth $50 million. But Marcus knew that Ranger's real contribution had been simpler and more important, the loyalty that had sustained them both during the difficult months when the future of Theodore's legacy hung in the balance. The Millbrook Creek Sustainable. mining project had generated $38 million in revenue during its first year of operation, while creating employment for 47 local residents and funding environmental research that was influencing mining policy throughout North America. But the project's most important accomplishment might have been proving that individual property owners could successfully challenge entire industries when they understood both their rights and their responsibilities. Standing beside the creek, where Theodore had first realized that some things were more valuable than their market price, Marcus understood that his inheritance had been more than mineral wealth or family land. Theodore had left him the opportunity to prove that ordinary people could make extraordinary decisions when they understood what was truly at stake. 5 years had passed since Marcus first followed Ranger down those concrete steps beneath the overturned washing machine, and the golden retriever was showing his age in ways that reminded Marcus how much their lives had changed. Ranger moved more slowly now, content to supervise from a comfortable spot in the shade, rather than exploring every corner of the property. With his former boundless energy, the memorial plaque honoring Theodore, Sullivan had been dedicated that morning in a ceremony attended by environmental leaders, government officials, and families from throughout the region who had benefited from the legal precedents established by Marcus's successful resistance to corporate pressure. The bronze marker, positioned beside the oak tree where Theodore's vision had first taken root, bore a simple inscription that captured the essence of his legacy. Theodore Sullivan, 1945 to 2018, mining engineer, environmental steward, defender of individual conscience. He understood that some things are more valuable than their market price, and that protecting them requires both courage and careful planning. This land stands as testimony to his belief that individual responsibility can triumph over corporate greed when, armed with good evidence and better principles. Marcus had spoken at the dedication ceremony about the lessons he'd learned during 5 years of managing the sustainable extraction project that had grown from Theodore's original vision. The Millbrook Creek operation had become the most studied mining site in North America, hosting delegations from environmental organizations, government agencies, and academic institutions that were adapting its innovations to similar challenges around the world. "My great-uncle left me more than mineral wealth," Marcus had told the gathered crowd. "He left me the opportunity to prove that environmental protection and resource development are not mutually exclusive when approached with respect for both economic necessity and ecological integrity." The financial success of the project had exceeded even Theodore's optimistic projections. Selective extraction using precision drilling had generated $42 million in revenue over 5 years, while preserving 93% of the surface ecosystem and actually improving water quality in the surrounding watershed. The Theodore Sullivan Environmental Trust now protected over 8,000 acres of critical habitat while funding research that was influencing mining policy throughout North America. But Marcus's greatest satisfaction came from the personal transformations that had resulted from his decision to honor Theodore's vision rather than accepting the easy money offered by corporate buyers. His struggling hiking guide business had evolved into the Millbrook Creek Environmental Education Center, which hosted thousands of visitors annually and employed 15 local residents as naturalist guides and environmental educators. Dr. Sarah Chen's research institute had become internationally recognized for developing extraction technologies that could access valuable mineral deposits while preserving surface ecosystems. Graduate students from universities around the world came to study at Millbrook Creek, learning approaches that were being adapted to mining projects from Canada to Australia. Even more importantly, the legal precedents established during Marcus's battle with the mining corporations had been applied to dozens of similar cases throughout the region. Property owners facing pressure from resource extraction industries now had both legal frameworks and financial resources that made Resistance possible when they chose to fight for sustainable alternatives. Agnes Murphy, now in her early 80s but still sharp and energetic, had become the unofficial historian of the Millbrook Creek case, speaking regularly at conferences about grassroots environmental protection and the importance of supporting individual property owners against corporate intimidation. People ask me what made the difference. Agnes told visitors during the memorial ceremony. It wasn't money or legal expertise, though those were important. It was Marcus's willingness to trust that his great-uncle had good reasons for the choices he made, even when those choices seemed crazy to everyone else. As the ceremony concluded and visitors departed, Marcus walked the familiar paths through the preserved sections of the property, with Ranger moving slowly but contentedly beside him. The sustainable extraction operation continued its work invisibly beneath their feet, accessing valuable minerals while maintaining the surface ecosystem that Theodore had fought so hard to protect. The creek ran clear and cold, supporting the beaver family that had expanded to include 3 generations and 17 species of native birds that nested in the protected oak grove. Children from local schools visited regularly to learn about environmental stewardship, while researchers from around the world studied the integration of resource development with ecological preservation. But the most important measure of success was simpler and more personal. Marcus had honored the trust that Theodore had placed in him, proving that individual conscience could triumph over corporate pressure when supported by careful planning, good evidence, and the loyalty of friends who understood what was truly at stake. As the sun set over the property that had transformed from inheritance burden to environmental model, Marcus understood that Theodore's real gift hadn't been the mineral wealth buried beneath the junk lot. It had been the opportunity to discover that ordinary people could make extraordinary decisions when they understood their responsibility to protect something larger than their own immediate interests. Ranger settled beside him on the porch, both of them content to watch the evening light fade over land that would remain protected for generations to come, testimony to the belief that some things are indeed more valuable than their market price.